Hey class, in this lab we'll be going over the user interface layout system in Godot. So we're going to be using the graphics created in the previous lab on user interface design, and then we're going to learn how to lay them out in Godot and add them into different scenes. So we'll start with a basic start menu, and then we'll add an instructions menu, and we'll also add a game over and a you win or win game scene in the game itself. So once we set those up, we'll do some documentation and post them on the Open Lab. So let's get started. So in this lab, we will be working on the layout for our start menu, as well as our instruction scene and a couple of in-game UI scenes. So let's return to our Mario interface and just look at how the layout is set up. So in this one, it's pretty straightforward. There's just a big title in the middle. There's some graphics at the bottom. And then there's a couple buttons that are laid out on top of each other in the middle. So everything is centered, it's very simple layout, and we'll create something sort of similar to this. You can make more complex things, of course. Let's take a look at a start menu from a more recent game. This is from the game Metro Exodus, and you can see that the UI in the start menu is actually built into this 3D scene with some animations and a lot of different stuff going on. So it looks more like you're actually inside of the game. But the functionality is the same. We are still making different choices. There's some more options, but ultimately it's still a user interface that allows us to start the game or create a new game or go to specific chapters. So you can expand on the options or the design of the start menu, but the functionality is going to be still very similar. So let's start by setting up our project. I'm going to open up my MMP 270 folder and go to my designer folder. So however you have this organized, you probably have a designer default folder, or you might have your own game that you're working on. You can follow along either way. We're actually going to just start from scratch. If you're in the designer default, you can actually just delete some of the UI scenes, and we're going to recreate them so we can go over all of the different nodes and setup that's involved. So let's get our art first. We need to go to our user interface design. And so we made the graphics and art in the previous lab, and we just want to make sure to move all of that stuff into our Godot project folder. So I'm going to select all these folders. I have a bunch of different sprites for this. So I'm going to select UI titles, the button template, the button start over, start, quit, and instructions. And I'm going to copy all of those and then go to the designer default and go to sprites and then paste everything. And so now if I scroll down here, we can see I've got my UI buttons and my titles. So I've got everything that I need to build out my UI scenes. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up my Godot project. And the first thing I'm actually going to do is delete my UI scenes. So it will open to the start menu by default. And this is what we're going to be recreating. But I want to start from scratch so we can go over all of the different nodes that we're going to use. So I'm going to exit the start scene. And I'm going to go to my scenes folder and just delete all of these. So I'm going to delete the start menu, remove to trash, and you win is another UI scene. Remove that. And instructions and game over. And it is showing me in a couple of cases that these scenes are linked in other scenes, but we can always go back and replace them. And it should be pretty easy. So I'm just going to click remove. So now I'm going to create a new scene, and I'm going to start over with my start menu. So I'm going to right click and create a new scene and call this start menu. You can see in our scene node hierarchy, we don't have like a default scene yet, but you can see the different types of nodes that it's suggesting: a basic 2D node, a 3D node, or this little green one is a user interface node. And so that's what I want to use. The user interface acts a little bit differently from the rest of our Godot scenes. You can see when I create that user interface node, we get this big box that's the same size as our game window. And that's because the user interface is overlaid over the game graphics. And so we kind of think about layout a little bit differently. We're not moving in the same space. Everything is kind of set up relative to our game window space. So I'm going to rename this main node start menu. And now we can start building out our scene. Doing layout in Godot is a little tricky. There is a link to the Godot UI documentation in the resources, and that'll kind of show you a lot more detail as far as everything that you can do in Godot. The layout system is pretty useful, but it's a little different than what you might be used to if you've used like Photoshop or something like that before. So I'm going to go over some of the basics. And the main thing to kind of talk about is that you have to use a lot of nodes to do very specific things. So you might think that I can center the image or center some text or do other things like that very easily. But a lot of things have nodes that have very specific purposes. So we'll go through our node layout and how to set up the layout that we want. So when I right click on my start menu and click add child node, you can see all of the UI related nodes are inside of this control node. And so there's a lot of different types of things in here that you might see in a UI. There's a pop-up, container, rectangles, a list of items, a label, all sorts of different stuff in here. Some of these are used for content and other things are used for layout. So a lot of the layout stuff is inside of the container. And there's different types of layouts in here, like the center container, which will center the children or contents of that node. There's a grid container, which is going to make a grid. There's a container for margins, a container for scrolling. There's all sorts of different containers that do specific things. So we're going to start with a center container, and we're going to be using a lot of these because we want to center different parts of our layout. And so I'm just going to click on center container and click create. And this is actually the first node in our layout. And you can see it creates this little box and it has some different things here. It has the red dots allow you to transform the rectangle or rect, which is the bounding area of the element. And the green pins are anchor points. If you look in the inspector, you can see that there's specific properties for all of these things like the anchor, the margin, the rectangle. All of these different things can be set directly using those properties, or you can move things around on the screen. Another thing that's pretty useful is just using this layout button. So if I just go down here, there's a bunch of different options. If I click full rect, now we see that that center container takes up the whole window. So the next thing I want to do is divide my layout into horizontal columns. And so inside of my center container, I'm going to add a new child node, and I'm going to put in a container, and this is a box container, and this is an HBox container. And so this is just to make columns. Anything I put inside of this will be laid out in specific columns. So I'm going to create that, and then I'm going to put some stuff in here. So I'm kind of creating this layout based on something that I've already conceived and I know what I'm going for, which is the layout that we saw at the very beginning. But you may have a different layout in mind, so you may have to play around with different things to try to get what you want. Inside of the HBox container, I'm going to have one side that has my title and my graphic, and I'm going to have another side that has my menu. And both of those are going to be centered themselves. So I'm going to have two nodes of a center container in here. So I don't always have to look through the node tree. I can type in what I'm looking for if I know. So I'm going to do a center container, and then I'm going to hit Command D and just duplicate that. And you can name this if you want. So I could name this like graphics and buttons if I want to make it more clear what's supposed to go in these different things. So then inside my graphics, here I'm going to actually add some content. So I'm going to add another child node, and then I'll delete center. And so if we look in the control, you can see different types of content. The texture rect is the most basic one where we can just add an image. So this is different from the rest of Godot where we're using sprites. And there's some things that make this a little bit difficult to work with. Like I wish that I could do sprite sheets with different frames, but this is how it's set up. So we're just going to use this. So I'm going to add in my texture rect. And in here, I'm going to add in the title for my game. So I'm going to go to texture and click empty and go to load. And then I'm going to go to my sprites and go to my UI titles. And here I have the title of my game. So I'm just going to open that up. And there it goes. So right now it's completely centered because it's inside of a center container that's inside of a center container. But we're about to add some buttons, and so then that will make it not centered. Another thing I can do, again, when I was making the art, I made it white. And I mentioned that the reason I did that is because I can actually change the color in Godot. So I can change the color to different values using this canvas item visibility and modulate. And so I can change the color here, and I might change the color to match different scenes. So I have my texture rect. I also want my graphics here. So I'm going to add another texture rect. And I could label these as well. I could call this the title, and this is the graphic. And so I'll go to empty, I'll go to texture, empty again, and go to load, and go to sprites, and go to my UI titles. And then this has my graphic here that is designed to go right under my game. And you can see they're actually laid right on top of each other. And that's because they're both in this center container and they're not both in the H box. So if this was an H box, it would lay them out next to each other. So the type of node that your graphics or your titles are inside of determines how they're laid out in the scene. So now let's add in our buttons. So again, if we put our buttons in, they're going to be overlaid on top of each other. So I actually want to add another container to make sure that they're laid out vertically. So I'm going to go here and add another child node. And this time I'm going to look for a VBox container. And so it's the same thing as my HBox container, but we're going to lay things out vertically. So I'm going to create that. So now I can begin adding my buttons. I'm going to click on the VBox container and add a child node. And I'll type in button here. And you can see there's a bunch of pre-built buttons in Godot that use some default Godot graphics. But we drew our own graphics using Pascal. So we want to use the texture button where we can fill in the different button states with our own textures. So I'm going to click create. And I'm going to rename this button Start Button. You want to make sure that it's called Start Button exactly the same way I wrote it there with the capital S and the capital B, because that matches the function that we're going to connect it to in the code. If you name it something else, you can always change the code and it may work, but it'll be a little bit easier if you just use the same naming conventions for the buttons that I use. For the other elements, you could change the names a little bit and it won't really matter. The reason this is important is because we're going to connect this directly to our code in a little bit. So for my start button, I'm going to go over to the textures, and you can see there's different textures for all the different states. We're just going to use the first three: normal, pressed, and hover. So normal is like idle, just how we see the button when we open the scene. Pressed is when we click on it, and hover is when we hover over it. The other ones are useful, but we're not going to go over those right now. So let's fill those in. I'm going to go to load for normal and go to sprites and find my start button. And I could actually choose any one of these different designs that we did. I'm actually going to go with the one with the white background so I can use that to match my game title. So I'm going to click open. And so now we see our start button. Let's add in the other states. So I'll go to pressed, go to load, go back to sprites and start. And for pressed, let's use the black one, and then we can use the dithered sort of gray one for in the middle. So that'll be pressed, and then I'll go to hover and use this kind of gray dithered one. And so we can see that'll work now if I preview the scene. If I hover or click, we can see those different states. So that's useful for us to know that the UI is working. So then we also can change the color of our button, and this will affect all of the graphics. So if I go down to visibility and I can click on modulate, and I can use the eyedrop to choose the same green as my title. And the nice thing about that is they're all in the same node, so they all take on that same green color. So it makes it easier to change the colors in different contexts if I want to do that with my buttons. And so now I've got the button set up. That looks pretty good. And so I'm just going to duplicate that. And so the next button we have is our instructions button. So I'm going to hit Command D, and I'm going to rename this instructions button. And you can see our VBox container is doing the layout where our buttons are sitting on top of each other instead of sitting exactly in the same place. So let's change the graphics for our instructions button. I'll just go to textures and reset these. And so I'll go to empty for the normal, find my instructions button, and I'm going to use the same setup here just to keep things kind of consistent. I don't actually have to do this. It doesn't change the functionality, but just visually it'll make more sense if we use the same states for each one of these. So I filled all of those in with the same ones. And that's pretty good. We don't really have to change anything else because we just duplicated it. Let's duplicate it again. And this time we'll make our quit button. That's all the buttons that we need on the scene. You might have other stuff, other scenes that you want to go to in your game, and that's fine. You can add more if you need to. So let's reset these for the quit button and then load and go to the quit and just find the right sprites for each one of these. And so now we have our three buttons. And so that looks pretty good. So now we can actually set up the functionality. So this is pretty much my whole UI layout. If you have other stuff that you need to add in here, maybe you have a lot more options in your game, you can spend a little bit more time adding this. The graphics also look really small. I could scale them, but that would mean I'd have to reset the layout. And so I'm just gonna leave them as is. I would probably wanna go back and scale up my original graphics and maybe export them again if I really wanted to change something. But your art is probably gonna look different, so I'm not gonna go through that whole process. So now we have to set up the button functionality, and we need to add a script to do that. I'm gonna click on the start menu, the main node, and add the script here, because all of our buttons are gonna be communicating to the same place. So I'll load a script here, go to my scripts, and find the menu script. And this is gonna be used, this is the same script we'll use for all of the UI, even if the same buttons aren't there. We don't actually have to have the same buttons in every scene to make them work. So now we just have to connect each button to our script. So I'll click on the start button. The way we're gonna connect them is using the nodes. So I'll click on the node and I'll go to pressed. And this is what we want to happen when the user presses the button. So I'll double click on pressed, and you can see this receiver method down here. So this is what I was talking about earlier. Godot is gonna generate a method based on the name of the button, and it's gonna try to connect it to the script in our scene. And I wrote the script so that it basically matches here. So when I click connect, you can see the green signal node goes straight to this function that's already there. If you've named your button differently, or you don't have their script or something like that, then you won't see this connect. But you can basically just set this up the same way. So just make the function and add in the same code here. If you have questions about this, we can go over it. But if you're using all these default assets, it should work fine. So we connected our first button, and we can see that that is connected to something called load level path. And so we actually have to tell this button where to go. So if I click on my start menu again, go back to the inspector, you can see there's a load level path. So let's test that out. I'm gonna click on the scene button, go to scenes, and for now I'm gonna choose my default scene and click open. And so when I preview this scene, when I click start, it should load our default scene. And so there's nothing in that scene, our player just falls and dies, but that's okay, we can see that it worked. And you can tell, you can extrapolate from this as well, that this doesn't necessarily have to be a menu. For instance, if you were creating a game that was like a choose your own adventure, where you didn't necessarily have like a platformer with physics and stuff like that, your whole game could actually just be UI elements where you have lots of graphics and then you have buttons for the user to make different choices. So depending on what style of game you're making, you might use UI for more things than just the menu. You could make narrative cutscenes that you click through with like a next button or something like that. So there's a lot more you can do with the UI than just create the menu. So let's build out the rest of this. Let's connect our instructions button. So we'll go back to the node, double click on pressed, and then this is going to generate our receiver function. I'll click connect, and we should see it connect to this function for the instructions button. It's very similar. It's going to use the instructions path. We actually haven't made that scene yet, so we can't test that quite yet. So let's go to our quit button and add that one in as well. So that's the same thing. We just double click, we get the receiver method, and then click connect. And that's just going to quit our scene. We can test that one pretty easily. I'll just play the scene and then click quit, and we can see that works. So then let's move on to our instruction scene. So we can use exactly the same layout to create the rest of our UI scenes because they all do very similar things. They basically just have some graphic that communicates something to the player, and then they have some buttons for the player to make a decision, like to start the game, to quit the game, or to start over. So the next one we'll make is our instructions. And rather than rebuild this whole thing from scratch, I'm just going to duplicate it and then replace some of the graphics. So you might want to change the layout and do different things. You could start over from scratch if you want, but I'm just going to duplicate. So I'm going to go to my start menu and duplicate, and I'll call this one instructions. This one's pretty simple. It's basically the same thing, except instead of the game and the graphics, it's just going to have the instructions. So I'm going to change this node to instructions so I don't get confused, and I'll make sure to spell it correctly. So for the instructions, I don't need this title here. I'm just going to delete that. And then I have a graphic that has all of my instructions in it. So I'm going to go to empty and click load, go to sprites, go to titles, find instructions, click open. And that's all the instructions for this game. It's pretty simple. You might have more stuff that you want to add in there, but that looks pretty good. I could change the color of this to match my buttons, or I could just make a different color. So I can click on modulate, and maybe for this one, I'll choose something blue. And then if I want, I can leave my buttons the same way to remind the player of the other scene, or I could change the color here. And so that's a kind of nice thing is I have these different scenes, so I can do different things like change the color. So I can go here and change the color to that blue for the start button. So that looks pretty good. And then obviously I don't need the instructions button because I'm on the instructions page. So I'm just gonna go ahead and delete this one. And then the quit button, let's change the color here to match everything else. So that looks pretty good. And then we also have to fill in the load level path, and that's already set because we duplicated it. So let's test that out real quick. So we can go to start, and that works. And we can go to quit, and that works as well. So that's pretty good. Now, if we want, we can go back to start menu and get our instructions path and go get the instructions scene that we just created. And so let's test the instructions button now. Okay, pretty good. And now we can start the game. And so that looks pretty good. So we're done with our 2 scenes that are kind of standalone UI scenes. The rest of our UI is actually going to go into a Godot scene. So I'm going to start by duplicating my instruction scenes twice to make the new UI. So I'm going to take my instructions and duplicate. I'm going to call one game over. And then I'm going to duplicate that one and call it you win. And you can really call this whatever you want. It doesn't matter that much because we're going to connect it in our code. But essentially what those scenes do is they appear on top of our main game scene, and they still have the same functionality. They still have buttons that we can click on, but they're going to be embedded in a scene rather than their own scenes. So once I've created those scenes, I'm going to open up game over. And so we need to change everything in here. And so there's just a few things that we have to update. I'm going to rename this to game over. So the first thing I'll do is replace my graphic. So I'll reload that texture, go to load, and go to my sprites and my UI titles. And so I have this game over. And again, I made this white so I can change the color if I want to. So maybe I'll make this like kind of red since we just lost the game. Something like that. And then again, I can change my buttons if I want to. So I'll go down to my buttons and just choose the same color. And again, this isn't really necessary, but it is one way that you can kind of make your UI look a little bit different in different places. And now I have the start button, and instead of start, I'm just going to replace that with start over. And so it'll restart that scene. And everything else we can actually leave the same. You could also include an instructions button if you want, but you don't necessarily need to. So I'm going to go to my sprites and find my start over button. And I just have to replace each one of those states. But I actually don't have to change the functionality. It does the same thing. So it connects from this signal to the same menu, and it's going to load a path. And so we can just reload the level that we're already on. So we can have the default scene in there. So we're not going to test this quite yet because we have to put it inside of our scene. So then the last scene that we need to create is the you win scene. So I'm going to make this based on the game over scene. So I'm going to take game over and duplicate and call this you win. Could also call it like win game. Maybe I should have done game over, game win, but this is good enough. So let's open you win. And let's change this to you win. And now, again, we're going to change our graphic. So let's reset this and go to sprites, go to UI titles and choose you win. And then again, if you want to change the color, you don't have to, but maybe something a little nicer, like maybe a pink color, something like that. And then let's change our buttons. So you don't have to have different colors for every scene, but it's kind of nice. And so that looks pretty good. And we just have the same functionality, so we don't have to change any of the code. The menu still works. Everything is still the same. So now that we've got those UI scenes, our game over and our you win, these scenes are not going to appear on their own. They're actually going to be layered over our main game. So let's go to our default scene and look at how to set that up. So I'll open up the default scene. And I have my scene manager here. And what I need now is a separate node to create a new canvas for my UI. So the UI is not going to be drawn on the same canvas as the rest of my graphics. So I'm going to go to the default scene and click Add Child Node. And so for this one, I'm going to use a completely new canvas layer. And so I'm going to create that, and I'm just going to call this UI. And I'm going to drag this up right below my scene manager. So now that I've got my UI layer, I just need to instance my two UI scenes in here. So I'm going to go to instance child scene and put in my game over. And you can see that's over there, and that looks pretty good. And then we do the exact same thing with you win. So that's down here. And you can see they're kind of overlapping on top of each other, but we're not going to show these scenes until something happens in the code. And so we can see what this would look like if we go to our scene manager. This has the scene simple setup, but if we actually go in and load the scene manager script and go to scene manager, you can see beyond the player path, which we connect to the player, there's also paths for the game over, which we can connect, as well as the you win, which we can connect. And there's a metrics path. We'll go over metrics in the next lab. And so you can see with these scripts, when we preview the scene, those two scenes actually become invisible as soon as the scene starts. So that's part of the code. If we look at the code for a moment, you can see it gets references to game over and win game, or you win, and then it makes them invisible when the scene starts. So you can turn these off. You probably want to when you're designing your scene, but when the game starts, we don't see them. And then when we die, of course, the UI comes up and we can start over, which just starts the same scene, or we can quit. And if you want to see an example of that in action, my level 1 from the level design scene is already in here, and you can see the game over and the you win are already built into this scene. And so that is already set up. And so if I play this level, it looks like I'm kind of in the middle of the level. So let's go over here. And this is from the level design lab that I built this. So now we can see our new game over UI comes up if we die in the scene, and I can start over and it will start up this same scene. And I can also quit. The nice thing about the way that this is set up is if I have a new level, like I have level 2 and I want to restart level 2 rather than level 1, I can actually change the script variables for this game over scene inside of the other scene. So I can change that value for each one of my different scenes. So it's a really easy way to add in these UI scenes to any different level and have them have slightly different behaviors. So that's everything as far as adding the UI. Hopefully the layout makes sense. You may want to play around with some of the other nodes and try out some different things. You could also try out playing with some of the default buttons. This is a pretty specific setup to the way that the demo game works. So you may have other things that you want to try. If you're not sure how to go about it, let me know and we could talk about solutions for that. So let's do some documentation. I'm just going to screenshot each one of my new UI scenes. So we'll get a screenshot of the start menu and a screenshot of the instructions. And then we can quickly run the game and die. So we can get a screenshot of the game over. I can't do the you win scene quite yet because I haven't gotten that far in the other labs, but let's just take a shot of this. And so now I have my screenshots and I'm ready to put everything on the open lab. So let's close Godot. So as usual, I'll go to make a new post and I'll find the categories. And this one is user interface layout. And I'll say my user interface layout. And so this is basically just learning the basics of building a user interface. And so let's just say here are my user interface layouts. And then I'm just going to drag these guys all in here and make a little gallery. And they all kind of look the same. So I think that's pretty good. I'm going to move this one down like that. And let's preview. I think it's pretty clear what all of them are, but you could add some labels, especially if you have other stuff going on. And so that looks pretty good. You might want to show all of them, so it's probably better just to give each one of them their own full screen. And so that looks pretty good. So let's go ahead and publish.